For a long time, I did not have the language for why I felt my life was so hard. I just knew that everything seemed to take more effort, emotionally, socially, mentally, in ways that were mostly invisible to other people. And the funny thing is I don't remember a single moment where I thought life is harder for me than everyone else. It was more so just this constant underlying feeling. It was just always there in the background. And because of that, for years, I genuinely believed that there was something wrong with me. I just thought I maybe wasn't resilient enough. I believed that other people were better at life than I was, almost as though everyone else had this manual that I missed. And that maybe if I tried a little bit harder, things would eventually click for me. I took my exhaustion as proof that something was wrong with my character, instead of recognizing it as a nervous system that was constantly being overworked. I carried a lot of shame around my emotions, especially how intense they could feel. I felt overdramatic, and I didn't have a framework for understanding why regulating those emotions felt so hard. I also struggled to communicate what was actually happening, what I was feeling, what I was thinking, and I quietly wondered why things like friendships or social dynamics seemed to come so easily to other people but felt so complicated for me. And when it came to decisions, I questioned myself constantly, worried if I was being too difficult or contrarian, when really I was just following the clearest path forward for myself. I just didn't know how to trust that yet. Everything really came to a halt when the COVID shutdown took place. When the world slowed down, I didn't bounce back the way that I thought I was supposed to or even expected to. Instead, everything I had been holding together, masking, coping, pushing through, started to unravel. And honestly, if it weren't for that forced pause, I don't think I would have ever gotten my later in life diagnosis. I don't think I would have ever stopped long enough to realize what I was experiencing wasn't personal failure. It was really something neurological that had gone unnamed for most of my life. I also feel like it's important to say this plainly. If it weren't for that moment in time, I don't know if I would be here today. And I mean that quite literally. And that is exactly why this podcast exists, because not having language for your experience, especially when you are struggling the most, can be dangerous. And because understanding yourself isn't just about clarity, even though that alone can change your life, sometimes it is about survival. So when I talk about recovering the sad girl, I am not talking about fixing something that was broken. What I'm talking about is understanding something that was never explained. I've felt like there was something inherently wrong with me for as long as I can remember. Part of it felt like a character flaw, and another part seemed like there was something mentally and emotionally off. As I entered my late 20s, I also started to suspect hormonal issues. When the world shut down in March of 2022, I could no longer rely on the systems I'd created to get through my daily life. Looking back, these systems were driven by fight or flight responses, fear of rejection, and my determination to avoid self-loathing. It might sound dark, but honestly, we're just scratching the surface. My mental health journey began by chance. Who knew that the pandemic would lead me to discover that I had been living with undiagnosed ADHD, and autism. I created Recovering Sad Girl to open up conversations about girls and women's mental health. If it weren't for creators who shared their journeys on social media, I would not be where I am today. And yes, I mean that quite literally. Women have historically been excluded from medical studies, including those on ADHD and autism. As a result, young girls often go undiagnosed compared to boys because ADHD and autism presents differently in them. Later in life, women with undiagnosed ADHD or autism often struggle with crippling anxiety or debilitating depression. RSG is a play on words referring to RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. That character flaw I mentioned, it turns out it was RSD all along. Go figure. And when I mentioned feeling hormonally off, it turns out that it was PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is essentially PMS on steroids. In each episode of this podcast, I plan to provide resources to help you navigate life as someone that's neurodivergent. The more we discuss these topics revolving around ADHD, autism, mental illness, and neurodivergence, the more we can learn about ourselves. And if this journey has taught me anything, the more I learn and begin to connect the dots, the more empathy I have for little Kelly, teenager Kelly, and adult Kelly. And my hope with this podcast is that you can find this same exact closure too. It truly is freeing. Before I go any further, I want to ground us in a few facts, because this episode is personal, but it is also rooted in reality. As of 2023, the CDC estimates that 1 in 36 people are autistic. That is the number that we have right now, even though that was 3 years ago. And personally, I don't believe that that number is going to stay where it is. And no, it's not because autism is suddenly more common, but because it's being better understood. A comparison that helps here is left-handedness. So for a long time, being left-handed was treated like something was wrong with you. Kids were corrected, they were discouraged, sometimes they were even punished. So of course the numbers for left-handedness looked low. No one wants to be under that scrutiny. But once society stopped treating left-handedness as a defect, the number of left-handed people didn't actually increase. People just stopped hiding because they weren't going to be punished for it. And I think something very similar is happening with autism and neurodivergence generally. As this understanding has grown, especially since 2020, more people have felt empowered to seek answers, advocate for themselves, and get the medical support that actually reflects their experience. For a lot of people, self-identification or self-suspecting is the first step. That was my first step, especially when access to a formal diagnosis isn't equitable or affordable in the United States. And don't get me wrong, there is a stigma on both ends. On one side, there's the dismissive narrative that is becoming all too common these days, that everyone's autistic now, that people are just looking for labels. But on the other extreme end, there's hesitation to claim a diagnosis at all, especially if your experience doesn't match the most visible or extreme stereotypes people grew up seeing. Something that is uncomfortable for me to talk about, but I feel is important, is autism is political. The progress that has been made over the last few years is fragile. Decisions made at a systems level can absolutely impact access to care, research, accommodations, and public understanding. And underneath all of that are deep systemic issues about how neurodivergent people are expected to function in a capitalistic society that often rewards only one type of brain. I also want to be honest about my own misconceptions because I think a lot of people will relate to this. A lot of us didn't see ourselves in autism because we were taught a very narrow vision of what autism looks like. I genuinely equated autism to the special needs education classroom many of us remember from childhood, where kids were often nonverbal, visibly struggling to communicate, or having intense outbursts that no one really explained. Those experiences are real and valid, but they aren't the whole picture. Growing up, we weren't taught about nuance, masking, or support needs. And we definitely weren't taught how many people fly completely under the radar because they don't fit that typical mold. And I really want to be intentional with my language here. Autism isn't about being high or low functioning, it is about support needs, access, and environment. And ironically, that narrow representation is part of why autistic people face such elevated mental health risks. When the only version of autism you see doesn't include people like you, people who can speak, work, mask, or pass as neurotypical, it becomes almost impossible to recognize yourself. And when you don't recognize yourself, you don't seek support. You internalize the struggle. As I've come to understand myself better, including my ADHD, which overlaps heavily with autism, I have realized just how much nuance exists within neurodivergence. None of this is clean or binary. And when you put all of that together, invisibility, lack of support, internalized blame, it starts to explain why the mental health outcomes look the way they do. So before I move into the next part of this episode, I do want to pause for a moment. In the next section, I am going to be talking about mental health and, trigger warning, suicide in a non-graphic, research-based way. But I understand that that topic can still be heavy. So if that is something you need to step away from right now, feel free to pause and skip ahead. You're welcome to come back when it feels safer for you. I want you to take care of yourself first. So when I first learned about the suicide risk statistics for autistic and neurodivergent people, I honestly wasn't surprised. And if I'm being honest, it felt validating. It honestly started to make sense. The intensity of the emotions, the overwhelm, the thoughts I had been having. It was giving context to experiences I had been carrying for a long time without explanation. Now, years later, I'm going to be 6 years into my journey as of this March, my feelings have shifted. Some days I feel grief, some days I feel anger. Because when I think about it deeply, I can't help but wonder how much suffering could have been prevented if we had done better as a society. So many people didn't need to die early. They needed understanding, support, and an open dialogue. And there was a period of my life where I didn't know how to regulate what I was feeling in a healthy way. I didn't have tools, I didn't have explanations, I just knew I was in pain and I didn't know where to put it. And I'm sharing this not to shock anyone, but because it explains why this data matters. When you don't understand what is happening in your own body and mind, it can feel like you are trapped in a cycle that you cannot escape. Learning about this research helped me understand that those experiences were not a personal failure. They were a response to being unsupported and unseen. And if I'm being honest, it makes me sad that this data still isn't talked about more openly or even fully accepted. These conversations don't fit neatly into the status quo. They're uncomfortable and people are afraid of saying the wrong thing. And there's a stigma around autism, neurodivergence, and suicide itself. A lot of the time, we only talk about these topics after someone is gone, when they're offering condolences instead of while people are still here and struggling. Seeing this framed as a systemic issue completely changed how I view my own past. It took it out of the category of what's wrong with me and it placed it where it belonged, in the context of access, environment, and support. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the metaphor of starting the day with a bag of marbles, but that helped me better understand autism and neurodivergence in general. Some people start with a full bag. Others have holes, maybe small ones, maybe one big one. Carrying the same load becomes harder, not because you're weaker, but because the system wasn't designed for your bag. There's also the spoon theory, which if you haven't heard about it, you should definitely look it up. That understanding shifted me from punishing myself to nurturing myself. And just because someone looks fine on the outside doesn't mean they are. I think back to who I was between 2020 and 2023, and I don't think most people would have realized how much I was struggling. And that's the danger with invisibility. And before we move on, I do want to acknowledge the weight of what we just talked about. If this brought up something for you, you are not alone and you are not expected to have to hold this alone. Whether it's confiding in someone that you trust or someone that could be considered a mental health expert or even going to a crisis resource, which I'm linking down below. So we're going to shift now into a different part of the conversation, one that's about support, healing, and what it looks like to live with more understanding and less self-punishment. That said, you are allowed to pause and take care of yourself for however long you need to before moving forward. I want to emphasize that when I think about healing now, it doesn't mean about fixing myself. It means staying informed about my diagnosis, my tendencies, and what my mind and body actually need. Healing looks different for everyone, but for me, it looks like nurturing myself more. Some days that means rest. Some days it means slowing down before I reach a point of no return. Over the years, I have built more self-trust, and with that has come less shame. I'm able to thrive more day to day now because I am listening and not pushing through for the sake of pushing through. Stopping the belief that I needed to be fixed allowed me to own my most authentic self. Over the years, I have felt softer and lighter, personally and professionally. And I stopped equating behaviors with moral failure. And through education, acceptance, and nurturing my inner child, which is honestly so important to do, life became easier. Not because challenges disappeared, but because I finally had context and I applied it to my life. Understanding myself mattered, but support mattered too. Now, this journey looks different for everyone, but medication for my ADHD and PMDD quite literally changed my life. I was raised to believe medication meant failure, that you should just meditate more or try harder, go take a walk in nature. I did all of that, and none of it helped the way that medication did. Because if your body is unable to create the right chemicals that balance your mental and emotional wellness, the store-bought kind is just fine. The first time that my high-functioning anxiety quieted, it felt freeing in a way that I didn't know was possible. It wasn't until 2020 that I realized that I had this anxiety existing for as long as I've been conscious, which is elementary school. I also now make accommodations, pacing my days, saying no sooner, adjusting expectations, especially around my cycle. PMDD plays a real role in this journey, and we will talk about that more in a future episode. Letting go of the need to forcibly push myself through my day every day has been essential to staying well mentally and emotionally. And I am far from perfect. I am still unlearning a lot. I'm constantly reminding myself that productivity does not equal worth, that pushing through does not equal strength, that rest must be earned, absolutely not, that emotions are inconvenient. That is not true. Unlearning those beliefs is ongoing, but it's also where healing lives. If you made it this far, I hope you feel less alone. I hope that something clicked for you, and if it hasn't already, I hope in the next episode it does. And I hope that you stop blaming yourself for things that were never meant to be carried alone. I also want to be clear about what this episode isn't. I am not here to diagnose anyone, and I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. This podcast is about lived experience, about what the research shows, and how understanding myself and my diagnosis and how it looks in my life quite literally changed the course of my life forever. We touched on a lot today: masking, PMDD, identity, late diagnosis, unlearning productivity culture, and there is so much more left to say. I'd love to know what resonated with you most, or what you'd like to hear about more in future episodes. These are conversations I want to spend real time on in the future. Also, notice that I named this podcast Recovering Sad Girl. Neurodivergence isn't something to be solved, it is something to be understood. You don't heal through punishment, you heal through compassion. And that is exactly what this podcast is about. And that's it for today's episode of Recovering Sad Girl. I hope this conversation gave you something to reflect on as you navigate your own journey. Before you go, I would so appreciate it if you could follow, subscribe, engage with this post, like, comment, and even share it with a friend that you think would benefit from this week's episode. And remember, you are not broken, you are not alone, and your story matters. I'm Kelly, this is Recovering Sad Girl, and I will see you in the next episode.